if you go back to say 2009, right? This was the beginning of, we didn't really use the term big data until around 2010. We didn't have the role of a data scientist until about that time. I think it was 2012 where I guess Harvard said the sexiest career is a data scientist. A couple of years before that, the role didn't really exist. We had data analysts, we had DBAs, database administrators, but data scientists really took off in 2010 because of the huge amount of data. And here's an article that was in Science, and this was the image from the article, where they said, look, people leave traces. We don't have to. If we want to do quantitative work, we don't necessarily need proxies for what people are doing. We don't necessarily need to survey them. We can actually look at what they do, the digital traces they leave, and infer all sorts of things, and it can be, and this particular example showed, and I know now it seems pretty obvious for those familiar with US politics that there are two different filter bubbles, right? There's the red Republican, there's the blue Democrat, and Republicans only talk to Republicans and Democrats only talk to Democrats. So we all see this now and we're thinking, yeah, duh, that's obvious. But at the time, that was pretty groundbreaking, because when Lada Ademic made that image, it was around 2005. And this was shortly in the wake after the internet. And there was a lot of kind of internet utopian thinking, right? Where a lot of people were like, ooh, now everybody has access to the same information. We're going to stop disagreement because we were, right? And there was this idea that we're going to eliminate polarization with the internet. Instead, it just made it a lot worse. And she showed that. So it was a really interesting finding. And it's this idea of let's let the digital traces because now everybody's doing everything on technology, and it'll open up new paths to research, right? So it's tremendous opportunity. Social media, mobile phones, in organizations, everything from ERP systems to emails, it's like everything we do has a trace. And Gerald Davis at the University of Michigan, right around the time, said, if we're organizational scholars, it's as if every physicist had a super collider dropped in their backyard. All of a sudden, we have this tremendous source of data where we can just analyze it directly and get all these new insights. We should be generating new theories. We should be doing really interesting things, right? We can use all sorts of different techniques. We can use networks. We can use sequence analysis. We can use text analysis. So now we have all these computational techniques, all this data everywhere. 2010, around that area, it really showed that now we can revolutionize what we do with science. So what did we do? Well, for that decade, the big data decade, we ran regressions, right? What we did was we went and got a bunch of this data. We took all the data that was out there, we turned it into variables, and then we ran regressions, okay? So nothing wrong with running regressions. As a matter of fact, if your argument, if what you want to do is test unidirectional exogenous causation, right? If that's your goal, I want to understand how one thing affects another thing. I want to eliminate all alternative perspectives. I want it to be, exogenous, right? And unidirectional. So it's that, then yeah, the econometrics turn in research for big data made sense. It's how we started getting at big data sets, right? But here's the problem. Most things that matter are not unidirectional. They're not exogenous. If they're causal, they're oftentimes mutually constitutive. They're way messier. So why is the only, and I mean the only, way in the decade of big data that we could analyze big data and do so scientifically and in a rigorous manner, why is the only way, the only thing admissible, unidirectional exogenous causation following econometric techniques? We need robustness checks for everything you can think of. We need instrumental variables. We need, to really establish exogenate, right? All this stuff, what we're doing is we're limiting what we can research. I'm not saying that econometrics is bad. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful technique for identifying a particular type of inference from large data sets and from particular situations in the world. I'm simply saying, maybe that's not the only way we should be able to analyze big data. maybe we should be able to get some inferences from maybe data sets that don't meet the strict criteria that econometric techniques have. Uh, I'll tell you this, there's a colleague of mine just looked around. Apparently a few years ago, Yelp, if you're familiar with Yelp, they do online ratings and that sort of thing for restaurants and such. And apparently what happened back in around the days of COVID, they added a Black-owned business little signal to their Yelp data. And they didn't do it all at once, right? They did it in different locations at different times, and they wanted to see and what happened is they made this data set available. And my colleague counted 110 research teams in the United States analyzing Yelp data for Black-owned businesses and what the impact of Black-owned businesses was on, the outcomes of those businesses, putting that little signal. That's not bad research. It's wonderful research. I have some colleagues that actually analyze that data set. I just question whether we should have 110 teams in the United States at top universities analyzing the exact same data set for the exact same reason. And the reason they were is because it meets the strict criteria. It was like perfect, field study, right? So it meets the strict criteria of the econometric method, and therefore everybody studied it, right? And that's fine, but I think we need to come up with ways to study things that maybe aren't as perfect, that maybe don't meet strict exogenous criteria, maybe aren't unidirectionally causal, and we could still generate inferences, right? So that's the drum I've been beating for about a decade now. And just to let you know where this comes from, we tried to do it quite a bit in the early 2010s, and all my papers were rejected, right? Because they didn't meet these criteria of econometric standards, right? We were trying to do other things. We were trying to generate theory. So a couple in the meantime slipped in, got accepted, and a few more are getting accepted. And then we've accepted some others, some of us who believe. So I think this is an emerging path where now there's enough precedent where people can actually publish this sort of work. So let's talk about what this sort of work is. And we can start with this guy. This is a guy, he's a philosopher he was at Carnegie Mellon. I think he's retired now. But he had an interesting idea. And imagine if he was right. He basically said that hypothetical deductive methods, what we were all taught, is simply a limitation of our ability to compute. That it's a shortcut. When you don't have all the data and you can't analyze the world as it is, you need to have shortcuts. You need simplifying assumptions. You need to generate hypotheses. Then you need to test those hypotheses. And I'm not sure I buy it 100%, but I love this as a motivating thought that, you know what, maybe we don't need to do hypothetical deductive methods. Maybe we can actually just, inductively, abductively generate ideas from the data that we see. And some of those ideas might be new and might be different, right? So in this vein, we wrote a paper back in 2019 in ISR. I would argue in our field, that's like the first paper in this paradigm that's specifically addressing the computationally intensive. Of course, it is rooted in, say, qualitative grounded theory and computational theory discovery in the sciences. So a lot of this stuff has been happening before, but we kind of integrated it. And then since then, there's been a number of papers that have been written where we are, and these continue to come out, right? And these are some of my some of the folks that I work with closely on this stuff. There are others that aren't on this. Kalle Luthinen, for example, my advisor, was really supportive of a lot of the stuff we did. But these are some of the folks, and now you'll see not just papers on how to do it, but papers that actually did it. So papers that used computationally intensive theory construction as a modes where we use some computing, usually a mixed methods-ish way of computing, and we concluded with propositions, right? So there's some quantitative, some computational, sometimes some qualitative. It's just kind of like detectives where we patch together an argument, made the, justified the argument, and then we concluded the paper with propositions. And the idea would be future research can test these propositions, right? So there's starting to be a nice critical mass. And as you can see, a lot of these papers are published in MIS Quarterly, where I happen to be an editor. And most of these people are editors, right? Stefan is a senior editor at MI's Quarterly. Shayla's a senior editor. Hani's an associate editor, right? So that's probably no accident that that journal is open to it, but is open to this particular method. And just to give a snapshot of what we in our first paper, what we said the method was, it's basically you have the world. And then what you need to do is pull some data from the world. That's going to be your sample. You need to identify concepts in the data. You need to identify associations of some sort among those concepts. And then those associations become your theory, right, that you put forward. Now, the key element we were arguing for in that paper was the role of the lexicon. And the lexicon is the language that you use. And the idea of the lexicon is twofold. First, it brings with it, it's your way of engaging with the theoretical conversation that you're conversants. And when you adopt a particular language, a particular lexicon, a theoretically loaded lexicon, that doesn't just bring with it words, that also brings with it the pre-theoretic understanding from those conversants, right? The folks who are doing that sort of stuff already have theory, right? If you're going to use the construct of trust in your study, for example, there's been, 40 years of research on trust. And there are different ways of thinking about trust. And so now what you have to do is you don't just use the word trust, you have to figure out which way you're going to use the word trust. Do I use the, psychological way where it has three dimensions of benevolence, confidence, and integrity? And, then all of a sudden you're situating yourself. When you choose the words you use, you're situating yourself in a discourse and you're adopting the pre-theoretic understanding of the discourse. So adopting a lexicon is not some trivial thing of just making up words, right? It's an intentional act where you are situating yourself in a discourse, right? And then you extend that discourse. You adopt the lexicon. Sometimes you try to bring two lexicons together. And that's a key. So just identifying associations isn't enough to generate theory. You now need to extend some cumulative tradition. And you need your conversants to extend that. So that was our argument. Really the key part of this paper that sometimes was overlooked by folks who cited it was this notion of the lexicon. And we had a very specific view, theoretically, a theoretical lexicon, the constructs that a particular community of researchers use, right? So we put that out and then people cited it and we ran into a problem. And the first problem we ran, and this is Brian Pentland, Emma Vast, and I think it's Jennifer Wolf. And these are scholars. These are legit people. These are really impressive researchers. And I read this paper. I was actually AE on this paper. And, it came and I realized, wait a second, they're taking our idea of lexicon and they're not using it the way I intended, right? They're just saying the lexicon is the language of the 300 codes that they use in the hospital, right? They're studying a hospital and they did a network thing and whatever. And they're saying, and I thought about it and I'm like, well, that is a lexicon, right? It's just not the lexicon I intended. I wanted the theoretical conversation. They're looking at the lexicon that actual people in the hospital use. So that was a first big problem that I ran into with our little original formulation of this approach. The second big problem I ran into was, and it was motivated by that academic paper, right? Which I thought, if one could argue that political polarization is one of the most important issues in the United States and perhaps many other countries in the world, right? And it gets in the way of doing other things, this polarization, right? And it's this horrible situation we have here in the US. And a lot of academic came up with this image that showed online, seems to encourage polarization. If in 2005 she would have submitted this to MIS Quarterly, it would have gotten rejected immediately. Her paper had some hypotheses, but it wasn't. Now, it ended up getting published in Science. As a matter of fact, it was the cover image a couple of years later for Science magazine, right? And I began thinking that, wait a second, if it can be the cover image for Science magazine and it would get rejected in MIS Quarterly, that's a problem. We probably should find a way to publish cool findings in MIS quarterly if we're doing this without necessary. So those were kind of the two problems we ran into. The first was that our little approach gave people no ammunition for publishing cool patterns, and we probably didn't address lexicon well enough, right? So the way we dealt with lexicon, we came out with this editorial a couple of years ago. And we decided, well, the reason is there are really three lexicons at play in a particular kind of inductive abductive endeavor when you're dealing with, right? The first is the practice lexicon. And this is where Brian Pentland and Emma Vost and Julia Wolf, were doing their work, and that's what they use in practice. That's what the nurses said. The nurses said, here come, this is admission, this is transportation, this is whatever words they use. And right, if you're studying engineers, right, they might talk about change requests, they might talk about approvals. The words they use to do what they're doing, that's the practice lexicon. Then there's the method lexicon, right? Depending on which method you're using. We talked about econometrics, right? You might talk about instrumental variables, exogeneity, things like that. If you're talking about social network analysis, you might, there are nodes, there are links, there's centrality, there's directionality. There are all the words that they use in social network analysis, right? So that's your method. So there's the lexicon of practice, and then there's the lexicon of method, and then there's the theoretical lexicon, right? And this is the thing that we talked about, where this is what I was originally thinking. This is the constructs that people use in a particular theoretical discourse to make sense of the world, right? You have to reconcile the practice lexicon and the method lexicon with the theoretical lexicon. Now, in the case of social network analysis, that gets a little easier because oftentimes the theoretical lexicon and the method lexicon overlap dramatically. In the case of econometric techniques, it's okay because it's a very high paradigm approach, so you don't oftentimes have to get at a theoretical lexicon. You can almost entirely focus on the method lexicon with practice. So there are ways around this, but in general, there are three different lexicons or lexica, if you prefer, that you need to navigate. And this is what we talked about in that. And then we said that, this is when you're surfacing patterns, you're playing with a variety of patterns you might find in your data. Any pattern itself is not a contribution. You have to relate it to what has come before, right? And what's interesting in practice, how it extends existing theory. So you don't just generate one pattern and then try and publish it. You try to always relate it to what has come before. So that's what we wrote. And that kind of addresses the lexicon issue. But then there's the other issue, which is, can I just publish a cool pattern? Why are you making me do the theory? Especially since there are a lot of like machine learning people and people who like the technology, but they're not necessarily theory people, and we can't expect everyone to do everything, right? So the idea is, how can we come up with a way to publish? And this is what we argued, that this grayed out area in the middle, we would argue, now maybe patterns with theoretical implications, maybe it's just a research note, maybe it's not a full paper, but we're arguing for publishing those things. And of course, the traditional theoretical contributions, where you problematize existing theory and you extend it in a rigorous way. Those are all theoretical contributions that you would expect, or those are both what we would argue is legitimate contributions from computationally inductive theory construction. And we're arguing that there are two things that are not. The first is grand theory. If you're going to do grand theory, if you're going to make the end all, be all, paper on digital innovation or something, you're not going to do it with an empirical contribution or a digital transformation or digital entrepreneurship, right? You'll do it with a lit review. And you do the lit review. So the grand theories, we don't think is the purview of computationally intensive theory construction. And we also don't think it's the analytics, like A/B testing and stuff like that. That's just industry research, right? And it's bad industry research, right? Industry has way more data than we do. So we'll just do a crappier job of what they're trying to do. So it's not data analytics. It's not grand theory. It has to be, we have to relate ourselves to the theory somehow. So one way, the strong way, is a theoretical contribution, which those of us concerned with theory have been taught. But the other way is patterns, just something cool. And we have to show that it has a theoretical implication, right? We don't necessarily have to problematize it the same way. We don't necessarily, right? It can be just a little really cool observation. And the argument is that the coolness of the observation should dictate whether it gets published or not. Now, of course, that's very subjective, but we have some ideas for how to get at that. So that's essentially where we are with how can you contributes, right? So in that editorial, and I'll just go over these pretty quickly. The first thing we ran into was, when is a pattern an adequate contribution? Right? And there are a number of different ways to make that argument. And I'll give you an example. The paper that I think we circulated, the one I'll be showing you here, we ended up with 8. We were studying open source, and we ended up with 8 open source projects that we studied. When we started the project, we had 5 open source projects that we studied, and we sampled them based on similarity. And then we found a pattern across those 5. And then the reviewers gave us a revision, and they said, but why are you studying only 5 open source projects? Why don't you study all the open source projects if you're going to make an argument about open source? And we're like, well, we don't want to study all. We're doing hard work here. We don't want to have to do everything, because it's all available. We could have conceivably done every open source project. We could have done every open source project since the beginning of time. But why do that, right? Our point is to make one little argument about, hey, let future research test it, right? Let future research extend it. We're not claiming we're going to make the end all be all final word on the topic. We're making one little contribution to the discourse. So the question is, when is a pattern adequate? And what we did is we then sampled 3 much different open source projects. And we found the same pattern. So 5 based on similarity, we found a pattern. We identified that the same pattern seems to hold for 3 sampled projects that are much different. And then we said, that's enough validation for us. And then they bought it, and they published the paper. So when is it an adequate contribution? What we argue is there are 2 different ways of thinking about it. And the first is the theory, right? If there's a given theoretical basis that has certain assumptions, and you are extending that, right? You're reformulating something about the theory. You're replacing some part of the theory, and you're showing evidence for it. You're extending that theory, and you can show it valid. Then so use theory as a way of determining when you have a contribution. But let's say you don't. Let's say it's not a mature theoretical space. Let's say you don't know the mature theoretical space. Then we think that even if you find something, a good contribution is it's original or important. So if you think it's time, and then it's your idea, right? There's no shortcut. It's up to the author to sell why their idea is important and should be published. But originality and importance are the 2 criteria we argue for, that if you can argue for it. And to go back to a lot of academics' idea of the polarization, right? She would start off and say, hey, everyone thinks it's going to be this utopia, right? Everyone has the same information. We'll all agree, and da-da-da. Look, it's not the case. So she used assumptions in practice to motivate her cool contribution, right? So that's kind of our first attempt. And what we're trying to do is give people a language for arguing. It's still going to be up to you to argue for, hey, this is why it's important. But we, in this editorial, we give that language. And this is the when do I stop collecting data, right? And here there are 2 different paradigms you can use. One is the statistical paradigm, right? Which is if you're representative, right? If you're drawing a random sample from a population and you have enough power, you can claim representativeness, right? So that's the statistical paradigm. Then there's the case-based paradigm, and this is primarily qualitative work. And I would argue and if anybody, you mentioned my podcast, if anybody listens to the podcasts we just had one with Brad Greenwood and Gordon Birch, and we were talking about econometric approaches. And I argued with them that every study we do is a case study. Okay, no matter if we looked at all the companies and all their data for the last 50 years, we're doing a case study of all the companies and all their data of the last 50 years, right? There's no necessarily, any findings we have won't necessarily generalize to the next 50 years or to another, or to the year before I collected data or anything like that. So it's always just a case. And if we think of everything we do as a case study, then we can use the case-based paradigm for justifying our sampling. And that's typically in qualitative research, but we can use it for computational and quantitative stuff too. And there are all kinds of single case designs, most commonly the representative. So it's a typical case, revelatory case, extreme cases. And then there are a variety of multi-case designs. One is theoretical sampling, where you continue your sampling as you're building your argument. The other is multi-case design. There are arguments around when to sample based on similarity, when to sample based on difference. We drew that from Eisenhardt's classic multi-case design paper, right? So again, what we're saying here is that your sampling plan determines your stopping rules, and it doesn't always have to be the statistical paradigm. You don't always need a representative data set. You can use case study logic, right? So that's the second argument we have. And then the final argument is this, that so I did my social network. Okay, when do you need to add a regression? When do you need to add some qualitative research to explore your explanations? When do you need to add sequence, right? When do you need, if you're not going from a strictly methodological paradigm, which is what we've done historically, except for mixed methods work, which is really uncommon and hard to publish, most of the time we use a method. If we're qualitative, we might use grounded theory, right? If we're doing experiments, there's a very specific behavioral experimental method that we're generally following, right? When you're using computationally intensive stuff, you can throw some machine learning at it. You could throw some of this, some of that. You can add different methods. And that's what we're running into, is people come from different traditions when they're reviewers, and they ask authors to, why don't you do this new technique, right? And this is a tough one. So again, you need to justify when you do and when you don't need to do something. And, you know, we would argue that robustness is one way. You do a bunch of robustness checks, you get data to eliminate alternative explanations, right? To help justify your inferences. Sometimes you can't do robustness. Sometimes you don't have access to the data. So you try to find some evidence for triangulation corroboration, right? So for example, let me give you an example of this. In an econometric study, if I were to, you know, publish my finding and someone said, here's an alternative explanation, I would have to get some data, right? Quantitative data, and then I would have to somehow control for it or otherwise address it to show that, look, my inferences still hold even when I include this other data in my regression, right? So the argument is, well, sometimes we don't have that other data. So you can't address that alternative explanation by just going to grab another data set. So what do? Well, maybe you look for a corroboration, right? You ask people, you call them, and you say, all right, what do you think? And you get some qualitative corroboration, right? Maybe I use another method. Maybe I use some text analysis, and then I triangulate, right? I find a similar finding using a totally different on my same. So what we're trying to encourage is not just one way of justifying inferences, right? And then similarly, concept operationalization, right? This is another thing that you run into with trace data, is that when I translate it to a theoretical lexicon, sometimes it's a stretch. So there are some different ways to justify, and here again, you might combine these. You might triangulate around operationalizations, right? So these are some of the other things we play around with. Again, the idea here is not to go over this thoroughly with you. It's to simply say, look, there is a language. It's all a creative act. In the end, computationally intensive theory construction is a creative act. It's you taking a data set, rigorously and validly trying to argue why you can generate some inferences from this data set that move our thinking forward. And how you do it, there's not one way, but there's a broad set of approaches you may or may not adopt to justify your particular approach, right? So again, creative act, that doesn't mean that anything goes. That just means that there are a variety of different tactics to resulting in a creative act. And to me, the most important part of computationally intensive theory construction, and one of the papers we cite, Amrit Tawana, he has an article where he talks about bricks in the edifice of our knowledge and how each paper is a brick. And this is something that's really bothered me lately with some of the editorial work and some of the author, is that people need papers to be perfect. And I would argue any particular paper is not perfect. As a matter of fact, there hasn't ever been a perfect paper published. They're all flawed. They all have a problem. They all have something, right? So any particular paper, we should probably not put too much stake in. If we have no other research on the topic, then yeah, maybe that's the first paper, and we maybe base some policy on it. But we better hurry up if it's important and do more research. Any particular paper should not be in the news. We should not make decisions off of it. We should be very humble about it, which we're not, which is a problem among academics. And then, because the world tries to pull us into the direction of saying that we know more than we actually do. If we were honest, we would say, look, it's my little crappy paper, and no one should make a decision off of it. And let's have a stream. And once we've been doing it for a decade, once there are 10 papers, 20 papers, and we've elaborated and corroborated and built an edifice, then we can start saying something, right? And if we take that approach to this research and say computationally intensive work is creative, we're generative, we're trying to validly say something, but it doesn't have to be perfect, because subsequent papers are going to extend it, refute it, do whatever with it, right? It's a group. We're building an edifice. We're not just doing a. And if we had this attitude, I think the world would be far more open to clever and fun contributions rather than only super rigorous contributions based on some specific criterion. Again, I'm not arguing against rigor. I think it's wonderful, but it's there. We should have a portfolio of research types in our field and in every field, where we have some rigorous, really in-depth hypothesis testing stuff. We have some generative, creative thinking stuff. We have a whole bunch in the middle, right? So, all right, that's my spiel on computationally intensive theory construction in general. If there are comments, or if anybody know, everyone just seems mesmerized, or they're multitasking because their cameras are off and or they're playing video games. So if there are any comments or anything, please feel free.